well, we have the greenhouse effect here too. If we keep going, it's going to become a positive feedback loop, and it's going to be 700 degrees here too. And I was like, oh, if someone like me makes this much trash, oh, that is a lot of trash. I can't do this anymore.
Welcome to Growing Places, where we explore the stories of the entrepreneurs and innovators who are changing the way we eat. Today's guest is Anne Fletcher from Orta Gardens. Welcome to the channel, Anne.
Thank you for having me.
Absolute pleasure to have you here. So, Anne, we have a lot of ground to cover today to talk about Orta, obviously, as well as your journey into the world of gardening. Before we do that, however, I'd like to take a little bit of a step back and maybe start with talking about how and why you first became interested in sustainability.
There's no single point. It's like a lot of little points along the way. I've always been just very connected to nature in a way that I think is unusual or a little bit more extreme than the norm. My mom even says when I was a baby, if I was fussy, she would just put me outside and then I would stop crying. And she one time put me outside and was doing the dishes and kind of forgot about me. Not totally forgot, but was kind of busy doing things and looked outside and realized it was snowing and she had left her baby outside. But I was in a jacket and I was fine and I was just singing and totally content. Over the course of my life, I've always just been very connected to being outside, to noticing nature. I was like marching for environmental causes when I was 12. Partly I grew up in Berkeley though, so that's kind of a thing. It was also stylish. It was also, I was surrounded by that. I also grew up in a family that spent a lot of time outdoors. And I remember even one time with my grandfather, I was giving him a ride to Thanksgiving. He was in his 90s and we were driving through some suburbs and there were literally tears in his eyes because he remembered when it was all open country. And he was seeing all car dealerships and freeways, and he was viscerally feeling this degradation of the environment around him. So I think I just grew up with that. I've always been an outdoor sports person too. That's how I went to college. I went to college to ski on a racing team, and then I started a surfing company in my 20s and spent most of my 20s in the ocean. So yeah, I guess I've just kind of always been there. So to me, it's not even like, is sustainability a cause? To me, it's kind of like, that's the way the world is, and everything that's kind of polluting the environment and not working harmoniously with the non-human world, it's like, it's jarring.
So I guess what I've heard just now is that you were developed with a very strong appreciation for nature and the outdoors. So I can completely see where that came from. Yeah. But help me understand when and how you went from having an appreciation of the natural world to starting to be very concerned about it. Because I get the sense that that's been a bit of an evolution or a voyage for you.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Remember when I was a teenager, my cousin got me a t-shirt. It was a green tie-dye t-shirt from the first Earth Day. The first kind of the modern Earth Days. I think it was 1989 or 1990. And it was super cool, green tie-dye in the 90s. And it was all about saving the Earth. And I was like, yes. It finally like that there was a thing to save that made sense with like these sort of feelings I'd always had. And I wore that t-shirt like every day. I was like, that's my identity now as a teenager. But then more and more as I got older, I studied chemistry and biology in college. So I started to understand, this is what these chemicals actually do to biological systems. Okay. I took an astronomy class as part of kind of the general ed of the sciences. And I remember a teacher told us about Venus and how Venus actually has a runaway greenhouse gas effect. And that's why it's 700 degrees on the surface of Venus. And she just matter-of-factly was like, well, we have the greenhouse effect here too. If we keep going, it's going to become a positive feedback loop and we're going to be in a runaway greenhouse effect and it's going to be 700 degrees here too. And I was like, no
big deal.
Is it actually true? It kind of stuck with me because she was talking about it, in astronomical timescales. Like it could happen. Right. So kind of from then on, I was like, oh, this is a real thing. And then I think the two other really visceral moments that it hit me that it was like my responsibility to do something. When I was working in Chile, I ran a surfing company where we made accessories for surfing. So board bags, backpacks, mostly soft goods. And they were made from basically PVC materials, nylon with PVC coating, so plastics. And when you do sewing work, you always cut out shapes, and then there's the shapes left over, right? The little scraps. And so from those, we would make smaller backpacks. And then from the scraps of that, we would make like wallets until we had like teeny scraps that you couldn't use for anything. But even still, I was carrying out 2 large trash bags full of plastic scraps pretty much every day. And one day I was holding these 2 bags, and I was standing on this like dirt road because it was kind of a rural area where we lived. And I was like, I am so small. I am a tiny company in a little town in Chile, like southern Chile, where there's no people around. This is how much garbage I make. Somehow I actually felt the scale of it. If someone like me makes this much trash, holy, that is a lot of trash. I can't do this anymore. That was when I decided I was going to change something. It took me a while from there to going to graduate school to learn about making products better. But that was kind of my first moment. And then my second moment was many years later after graduate school. Turns out the sort of companies that hire people with my education tend to be large consumer product goods companies. And I was doing research for fast food company because I was working for a consultancy who got hired by a fast food company. And we were flying around the country going to mall food courts to help the company figure out their strategy for the mall food court. Which needless to say was already not really all that in line with my values, but it was what pays the bills. And I would come home from those trips and go for a walk in a park near my house and cry for like 5 hours. It was almost like I needed like kind of an emotional, spiritual purge of this like pure consumption environment. And it was in that phase that I decided I was going to just save as much as I could in order to phase out my consulting life and start building a business where I can make a living working within my own values, working towards what I'm trying to do instead of directly against it. That moment, kind of crying in the woods, was the genesis of like, I'm going to do something different. And then it took many, many years after that to figure out, well, what is it and how am I going to do it?
Wow, that's quite the story, quite the history. There's obviously more and more people who are starting to think about and be concerned about the environment and sustainability. And I feel like there's a spectrum that people sit along from kind of optimism and hope on one end to, despair and anxiety on the other end. Where do you see yourself on that spectrum, and how do you kind of deal with that?
I would say I'm mostly in the despair camp, which means that I work really hard at hope in my personal life and in ways that have nothing to do with sustainability. Like I make sure I get enough exercise and enough sleep, and I take care of my body and my emotions so that I don't fall down the pit of despair, so that I can actually cultivate hope and get something done. Because in the pit of despair, I get nothing done. And if I get nothing done, then it's even worse, right? Like we all have to care for ourselves and care for that part of us that can actually make a difference. So, naturally, I way fall into the pit of despair camp.
And am I correct to understand that you've sort of settled on gardening as one of those tools or mechanisms to try to pursue hope? Is that how the past time of gardening kind of fits in here?
Absolutely. I can always go out in the garden, and it's amazing. Even if things look really awful, even if there's weeds, just pulling some weeds or watering or like tying in a tomato is just so calming to have that connection. It works every time. Even when I'm just in a horrible, horrible mood, I can tend to something, even if it's a houseplant, because there's some days when I can't even get outside. Picking the dead leaves off a houseplant and watering it is also really, really soothing.
I also wanted to ask you about the Monk Manual. I read an interview recently that you'd done with them. Are you still using the Monk Manual? And if so, what is it? Why do you use it? And kind of what's it all about?
Basically, it's a planner. And I'm a naturally quite disorganized ADD sort of person. So I need a planner of some kind or else I'll just go off the rails. But what's different about it is that it has you reflect on your day and plan in various timescales. So you plan kind of your overall goals for the year, and then you break it down by quarter, by month, by week, and by day, so that you kind of know you're on the right track. I have pretty big goals. I'm trying to build a company manufacturing responsibly in the United States, and my competition is 0 Fs about anything sustainable or responsible or paying living wages or anything, right? So my cost side is way bigger. But it's the right thing to do. It's a big challenge. And in order to do that, I really need to stay on track. Day
Yeah.
to day, it's a planner that helps you both check in with where you are, how did things go today, and then be conscious about how you're going to live the next day.
So you obviously live in California,
Yep.
Berkeley, as I understand it. How do you think that has influenced your perspective on sustainability and the climate crisis?
That's a hard question because, of course, I haven't grown up anywhere else. I only grew up here. Well, two ways. One is that kind of from a political perspective, there's general agreement around here that, the environment is a worthwhile thing to conserve, that climate change is real and human caused. In a certain respect, I feel like I'm surrounded by my people. On the other hand, it's kind of an interesting contrast because it's a fairly affluent community where people drive electric cars but fly a lot. I think that it brings a lot of the climate change issues really quite into the forefront, which is that it isn't just political, it's personal, and it's about our collective habits and our collective values, right? Because it's very easy to be like, oh yes, of course I believe in the environment, but also I want to go to Europe every summer. Or I believe that climate change is human caused, but my gardener comes every week and uses a blower, but that's not my problem, that's his problem. So there's this kind of compartmentalizing of the political, of course I vote for the environment, and the personal, but I'm not going to change my habits. But then, of course, the flip side of it is, even if each individual changes their habits, but our petroleum industry continues the same, we're not going to get anywhere anyway. Being in this mix is kind of a complicated place.
As I listen to you talk about all this and the journey that you've been on the last few years or decades, it's clear to me that you've thought a lot about it. It's also clear that you've spent a lot of time reflecting on your roles and your responsibilities and the personal obligations that you have here. And it sounds like you've been on a really fascinating voyage with some of these topics. If we had a magic wand and you could rewind and give some advice to a 20-year-old version of yourself, what would you say to her?
20-year-old self didn't listen to anybody, so that, first of all, it wouldn't have been very useful. But
a short conversation then.
Honestly, I think to be more financially responsible from a younger age, to have more freedom sooner, to kind of exit the rat race, to not have had to spend quite as many years doing the corporate grind that I did, and to perhaps even to have been able to kind of start a company with more financing from the beginning. I think that would probably be it, to have been more financially aware earlier on in life.
Tell me about how Orta began. How did the idea that has since grown into the business actually get started?
Like I was saying before, I was having those epiphanies where I was crying in the woods working for a corporate company, and I just needed to do something different. So I literally sat down and wrote out a list of the categories I felt I could work in that were good. One of them was water conservation, and the other one was plants. And at the time, I was very much a novice gardener, but I liked it. And for me, the obvious connection of those was irrigation. And so I actually started by working on irrigation. So I was building drip irrigation systems that were easier to use, because I don't know if you have drip irrigation at your house, but it's horrible. It just breaks all the time, and it's a real pain in the neck. So I actually built a whole product category around much easier to use, low toxicity drip irrigation. And I would show it to people, and they'd be like, oh, that's okay, that's neat. After I explained it all, and I was like, okay, there's no traction here. Nobody's excited about drip irrigation. And at the same time, I was still traveling a lot for work, and I was killing seedlings, in particular Thai basil, because I love it. And at the time, you couldn't get it unless you grew it yourself from seed. And so I would leave these seedlings, and I would come back and they'd be dead. Or I was working so much that I wouldn't remember to water until 6 p.m., but they would have died just by not having been watered for 12 hours. And so I started building all these little contraptions with wicks and strings and whatnot, and they were horrible and ugly, but they would keep my seedlings alive while I was on a business trip. And I was like, oh, okay, great, I got this. And then I was thinking, it would be way prettier if it could be a different material. And what material is porous enough to wick, but non-porous enough to keep the water inside? And that's ceramics. is one of the few materials where you can have both in the same thing. And so then I started taking pottery classes because I was like, I had no experience with clay at all. So I started taking pottery classes and little by little started building shapes that worked. And then the first one, today's 60 actually, that was the first mold I ever made. I made the mold and I started taking these shapes into my pottery class to use the kiln there. And as they came out of the kiln, the other people in the class were like, oh, that's so cute. I want one. What is it? And I was like, there we go. That's it. Somebody thinks it's cute and they want it, and I haven't even had to explain the function yet. Drip irrigation went by the wayside. I learned to make molds and make more pots, and I was off and running from there.
Amazing. How did you actually fund it initially, and how did you pay for all of these molds? I assume there's a fair bit of expense in some of this stuff.
No, not in the molds at the beginning. I just taught myself to make them. So the expense was in plaster, which costs 45 cents a pound. I was just doing it in my garage. So I made all the first molds myself, and then I taught myself to make master molds, which was kind of a disaster. Still, yeah. I mean, we're talking about a few $100s of materials here. We're not talking tens of thousands of dollars of production runs. Okay. And so I was still working full time as doing design consulting work. It's kind of like a hobby, like you spend money on your hobby. And I was the money I was spending to fire it and do all of that wasn't actually all that big of a deal. But then when I wanted to start making bigger models, I needed help to make the master molds for bigger molds, which I didn't know how to do. Or I kind of conceptually knew how to do, but didn't trust myself to do it properly. And so I did a Kickstarter for that.
And could you actually tell us a little bit about how these products work?
They're made from terracotta, which is porous, and they're hollow inside. So you pour the water in through the hole, and it fills the reservoir. And then the water seeps across the terracotta wall and keeps the soil just evenly moist. So seedlings need to be watered. If you're not using a self-watering system, they need to be watered 2-3 times a day, just a little bit, not too much. Whereas with the terracotta, it seeps through and just stays evenly moist for about a week between filling the reservoir. Yeah, that's how it works.
And so there's no moving parts, there's no pumps or motors or anything. This is what you'd call a completely passive system, right?
Yeah, completely passive. No pumps, no electronics. It's just the shape and the makeup of the material that makes it work.
Got it. And you mentioned seedlings just now, but what are the range of use cases that someone could actually use one of these products for?
Yeah, so I actually started it for seedlings because that's what I was killing and wanted to keep alive. And at the very first fair that I was selling them, some people came up to me and were like, this would be perfect for microgreens, which at that point I'd never heard of microgreens. This was like many years ago. And so I started doing microgreens and I was like, yes, that's great, except the pockets were a little small. So I made another set of shapes that are more suited for microgreens. So those are the two main use cases, but they're also great for rooting cuttings too. So if you want to root herb cuttings and also succulents. Succulents are great too because you can do that in the off season when you're not doing more active seedlings. You can put some succulents in, they'll root and they'll stay, making kind of a nice display for 6 months or so as they root and get established, and then you can take them out and move them on.
I always thought that succulents didn't need a lot of water, but you're talking about putting them in a device where they're constantly watered?
Yes, though it's basically you fill it once and then leave it alone for like 6 months.
6 months? Wow. Okay.
Give or take, yeah. I mean, in the humid, I do it through the winter here where it's cool and humid. In the summer, you might give it some more. And you also mix it in with about half potting soil and half sand or gravel so that it's nice and airy.
And are there any special tips or hacks that you have for kind of getting the most out of your Orta gardens? Any kind of insider secrets that you'd like to share? So
a lot of what I've learned over the years is about the different types of plants and what they like. So for example, lettuce is the most forgiving by far. You can leave lettuce in a pot where it kind of starts to get stunted and constrained, and you can still transplant it out and it'll start growing again just fine. Tomatoes are like that too, which is great for those of us who are either a little bit neglectful or you don't really know when to transplant. Kale and all of the brassicas, but in particular kale and broccoli and bok choy, those ones are really, really sensitive to having their roots squeezed. And so with those ones, I've learned you really have to transplant those guys earlier than you think. So you don't wait until they look like they're kind of big plants ready to go out. You kind of have to take them out when they're babies. And the list could go on, but I would say that The pro tip there is to look up on the internet whether or not a plant reacts to having its roots constrained, because those that react to that need to get transplanted early.
I probably should have asked this earlier, but how do you define the mission of the company? What is it that Orta is really setting out to do?
There's two missions. There's the really straightforward one, which has always been there, which is I want to help people start seeds. I really want to help people be able to participate in this world, because if we can keep the seedlings alive, you can grow so many different varieties, and you can participate in that cycle of the magical seed sprouting all the way to collecting your own seeds and saving seeds and trading seeds. It's this whole world that opens up, and I want to open up that world. I want to help people connect more deeply to nature in that way that I was talking about earlier. That connection that I find really healing, both for me and for the earth. I think that the more of us that are feeling that and the more of us that are acting on that, the more able we will be able to take collective action for environmental change. So I'm always kind of working that in the background too. Is like, how do I help people develop that connection and develop these muscles of conservation?
I love it.
And then, of course, that goes to every aspect of the company, you know, in terms of our non-toxic manufacturing, in terms of our low-energy manufacturing, in terms of our plastic-free promise with packaging and everything, right?
Yeah.
So it's you keep peeling back the onion, and we're working on sustainability at every level.
Is there a lifetime of the products, or is this the sort of thing that, you know, with proper care and maintenance, you could go on using for years or even decades?
Oh, yeah, years and decades. We have a lifetime guarantee also. I definitely still have some of the first batch that I ever made, which at this point is 12 years ago now, and they work just fine. It should last for your whole life if it's a properly made piece of pottery.
Yeah. Amazing. And am I correct to understand that you're actually involved with making these products yourself, even up till today?
Yeah. I mean, it's on my list to go get some materials today from the clay store.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
The production facility is right here in Berkeley. I go in every day. I don't do 100% of it myself anymore because it's just too much. But yeah, I still manage the production. I still do a lot of quality control. I do most of the training of everybody working in production. And I do a lot of the troubleshooting because it's an extremely analog process where there's little defects you can start seeing as, say, a clay batch gets a little out of balance. You know, so it's my job to kind of keep an eye on those balances as they go through.
And how big is the team in entirety today? How many people are at Orta?
Currently 3.
Okay.
And we kind of come and go as far as bigger and smaller depending on the season. So right now at the end of summer, it's our slowest season. We start picking back up again, and we're actually going to be starting to hire again next month.
And where do you hope to see this business go in the future, 3 to 5 years' time?
We are in a relatively new facility that's bigger than our old one. So I want to start by maxing out the facility we're in now. So we're just going to keep doing what we're doing and incrementally increasing our volume and our quality control and just kind of max out that facility over the next year or two. I've also got a few prototypes in the works of new materials and new products that work in a similar way, but for larger scale. So for the folks that look at the Orta stuff and say, this is great, but I need this big. I'd love to grow into a brand where we're helping gardeners all the way from the seed to the harvest with sustainably minded tools all the way through. And it's just a matter of kind of incrementally building till we get there.
Yep. Step by step. I hear you. Yep. What do you consider your definition of success, firstly with the business and in life more broadly?
Oh, wow. That's a good question. Success for me in business, it's funny because, you know, living here in Berkeley and I lived in Silicon Valley for a long time, so much of what we talk about as success in business is like the unicorns and the billion-dollar buyouts and all of that.
Yeah.
You hear people talk about like a lifestyle business in sort of a derogatory way, like, oh, that's just a lifestyle business, which to me, that's totally my definition of success, right? Is a business that allows you to make a good living and pay a living wage to a core group of people. If everybody's making a good living wage and we're doing something responsible that we're proud of, I mean, to me, that's success.
Could you talk us through the steps of actually setting up an Orta garden for the first time?
It's pretty straightforward. It depends on what you're doing. For seedlings, you need four things to start. You need your Orta pot. You need some seed starting mix, like a soil medium of some kind. And we sell one that we really like, but it's basically any sort of seed starting mix that's fine textured. Anything chunky doesn't work very well because seeds are little, so it has to be fine. You need your seeds, obviously. And then you need a spot with abundant bright light, which is, and this is, I think, where beginners go wrong a lot. It has to be really bright, like not just a regular windowsill. It has to be like 8 hours of sun a day or grow lights, which was a mistake that I made a lot at the beginning. So you need those four things. And then you moisten your seed starting mix if it comes dry, or you just use it straight out of the bag. You put it in your pot. You put your seeds in. And every seed is a little different. Some like to be on the surface. Some like to be buried a little. Some like to be more deeply buried. The seed itself will tell you, the seed packet or the internet. You give them a light sprinkle to settle them in so that the soil and the seeds are making good contact with each other. And then you fill the reservoir and you put it in the bright spot until they sprout. For microgreens, we sell a whole kit. You just use what's in the kit. It comes with the seeds in the soil already. And microgreens, you also don't need extra light. Just a kitchen counter is fine. Soil mix we have comes dry. And the reason I sought that out is so that we can ship it without plastic. So it ships in paper bags instead of plastic. So you hydrate the mix, put it in your pot, you put the seeds in, you put a little bit of the mix on top. And again, you water it a little bit from the top for contact with the soil, fill it with water, and leave it on the kitchen counter until you want to eat them. Compost them when they're done and start over.
Sounds very straightforward. What are some of your favorite things to grow in the garden, ideally with an Orta pot? I understand you're a bit of a tomato lover, I think. Did I get that right? But what are your favorite things to put into an Orta garden?
Tomatoes I do every year. And I'm always on the hunt for just the right variety because we've got a weird tomato climate here because our summers are usually very cold between like June and August, which is when most people's tomatoes go nuts. Ours are just anemic. So we need fast growing varieties, but then we get a lot of heat in September and October. So I've got some great ones this year that are giving me, none of them are ripe yet. It's the end of August and I have all green tomatoes. I have, at the shop where it's actually a little bit warmer because that's down kind of in a concrete heat island. The tomatoes are a little happier. Here at my house, they're still green, but I have a ton of them, so this is exciting. So that's what I'm growing this year. The other thing that I love to grow is, and it's kind of boring, but I love to grow greens of all kinds because they're kind of more bang for your buck. So I love to do lettuce because it's easy. Like I said, it's the one that if you leave it in your Orta pot and you forget about it and come back later, it transplants very easily and is very adaptable. And there's another one that I like to grow called Mispuna, which is a hybrid of Mizuna and Tatsoi. When it's little, it makes a good salad green, and when it's big, it makes a good cooking green. And it's just tough. It weathers heat, it weathers drought, it's cold tolerant. So I just have that in the garden year round, that like there's always something green to eat, and it's like the lowest maintenance one. Could
you tell me a little bit about the materials that you're using to make these products and what makes them special?
What makes them special, actually, it's not the materials themselves, it's what we leave out. So most terracotta formulations have a material in it called barium carbonate, which is also one of the most common rat poisons.
Wow.
It's kind of nasty stuff. When I saw that on the list of ingredients when I was learning to make clay, I was like, I'm not wild about that. But, that's what the experts do. Like, that's what's in the recipe. So my first few batches of clay, I put it in. But I felt really uncomfortable just even having that around. I felt uncomfortable handling it. I knew that it was in the liquid clay. Because once the clay is fired, if it's fired properly, it shouldn't ever leach out. But I didn't feel good about it because you never know if something doesn't fire properly or something goes wrong. And also just having that around the studio, I didn't want to have it. So we reformulated the clay completely to take that out. So we don't have it anymore. And it means that we get like this sort of streaking on the surface sometimes, like almost looks like white salt on the top. That's because there's no barium carbonate in the clay. The other thing we did is, so most ceramics that's low fire like ours, that's low energy firing process, is fired twice. So first to just firm up the clay, and then you glaze it, and then you fire it again. We reformulated all the glazes in order to put them on the raw clay and only fire once. It seems like such a minor thing, and in the end product, you actually can't tell the difference, which is good. It took us like a whole year to deal with that, to use half the energy overall in our process. And also, of course, because we make all of our own glazes, they're lead free. We know exactly what's in them. We're just committed to non-toxic manufacturing at every stage.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I understand the product is plastic free as well. Was that an easy thing to achieve, or was it relatively straightforward to get there?
Well, with the pottery part, that's straightforward because there's no plastic in pottery anyway. So,
Sure.
and that was why I chose that to begin with. Where it's been really difficult is the packaging, especially shipping pottery long distances and not having it break and not using bubble wrap. That has been a huge headache. There's no plastic anywhere in the packaging, and that's very hard to avoid because plastic bubble wrap is cheap and effective,
Yeah, yeah,
but then it's bubble wrap.
yeah.
And also too, we've gotten the plastic, like we use only paper tape to close our boxes. We use plastic free shipping labels. I mean, at every level. So that has been a major pain in the behind.
Well done on figuring it out. That's an accomplishment, and on behalf of Planet Earth, we're grateful. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I wouldn't call it mission accomplished yet. We're still little by little. Like, we don't have it in there, but we've got to figure out how to do it in a more cost-effective way. So anybody out there who wants to help and participate and bring the costs down for all of us,
Yep.
let's do it.
Thank you very much, Anne, for being on the show today. Been great to catch up with you, and best of luck for everything that lies ahead for Orta and you personally. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me.